Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to chapter 3 of our History of International Politics lectures. We will have a look today at the period going from 1648, the end of the 30 Years' War, to 1815, the definitive defeat of Napoleon. We saw in our chapter 2 last week that the 30 Years' War ended in 1648 with the victory of notably France, Sweden, the Dutch, Denmark also belonged to the victors, while Austria, Spain, and the Catholic entities of the Holy Roman Empire were defeated. We will come back in our second part to the meaning, the normative consequences of the Westphalian treaties. They introduced the sovereignty principle, replacing the imperial principle regarding the material power configuration of the period started in 1648. 1648 was synonymous with the definitive decline of Spain. Spain admittedly did not sign the two treaties, the two Westphalian treaties that were signed in the two Westphalian towns of Osnabrück and Münster. In Osnabrück, Sweden and Austria signed the treaty. In Münster, it was France and Austria. The Spaniards did not participate in the peace negotiations. They went on actually fighting against France, notably for the control of the southern part of the Low Countries, roughly today's Belgium, today's Luxembourg, and also they were fighting for maintaining Catalonia in Spain, but they were definitely defeated. They were definitely defeated in 1659, so 11 years after the end of the 30 Years' War, and Spain accepted to sign the Treaty of the Pyrenees, which permitted France to control the northern part of Catalonia, which still today is part of the French territory. More generally, the Pyrenean peace, Treaty of the Pyrenees, definitely broke Spain's back. And thus it paved the way for a new period, the one that starts in 1648, one that we will have a look at. The new period characterized first by the rise of France, and then by the rivalry opposing mainly France to Great Britain. I say mainly because when we look at the numbers of powers, of European powers, of the then international system, what do we see? We see that there were 6 powers, 5 or 6 powers, which means that the system was multipolar. The definition of multipolarity, you know it, I gave it in the introduction. A multipolar system is a system where there are at least 3 major powers controlling each a roughly equal amount of material power resources, mainly economic resources and military strength, of course, and also practicing a shifting alliance strategy. There were then 6 major powers, but to some extent, if I emphasize the fact that there were mainly 2 powers whose rivalry will define our period from 1648 to 1815, maybe we could say that there was a kind of bipolarization process. That is to say, though the power polarity, regarding the power polarity, there were 6 major powers. Regarding the cluster polarity, that is to say, the way the different powers allied or were grouped into 2 sets, 2 groups. Maybe there was a bipolarization, that is to say, England on the one hand, and France on the other hand, were the head of regularly appearing rival groups, rival alliances. Anyway, The six powers were the following ones. France, of course, thanks to its victory. Austria, despite its defeat, remained a significant power. England had not participated directly in the 30 Years' War, and it had profited, of course. In order to do what? In order to expand overseas. So it had consolidated its overseas ambitions. The Ottoman Empire, ladies and gentlemen, was a fairly significant power at that time. It occupied the southeastern part of Europe, roughly today's Balkans. So four powers plus two new ones. These two new powers replaced all at once Sweden and Spain. Prussia is the fifth major power, replaced Sweden. Why? Because Sweden, after its victory during the 30 Years' War, occupied the northern part of what today corresponds to Eastern Germany, that is to say, Brandenburg, Prussia, Pomerania. And Prussia ended up in managing to expel the Swedish occupying troops. And thus it gradually became more and more powerful within the Holy Roman Empire. As such, it became a challenger of Austria that was still dominating the Holy Roman Empire. To some extent, the stage was set for this rivalry that characterized the Holy Roman Empire during two full centuries until the 1860s, when Prussia definitely got rid of Austria. Prussia was the fifth, and Russia will be the sixth major power of our period. It profited from Sweden's gradual decline to wage at the beginning of the 18th century the Great Northern War in order to control the Baltic Sea. Russia also expanded in the Caucasus against the Ottoman Empire. So six major powers: France, Austria, England, the Ottoman Empire, Prussia, and Russia. The Netherlands, who were defeated, the Dutch who were defeated both by the British, we'll come back to the wars that occurred during this period, both by the British and by the French, progressively abandoned power politics to become, to some extent, an exclusively commercial power, a trading state, which they are still today. And ladies and gentlemen, this decision of the Dutch rulers to no longer practice power politics is at the origin of the American scholar John Muller's thesis of the obsolescence of major war. He calls the process consisting in abandoning power politics, he calls this process Hollandization process, an allusion to what the Dutch had done, according to him, at the end of the 17th century. John Muller is, broadly speaking, a liberal scholar. That is to say, he believes in progress in international relations, international politics. According to him, war or power politics are not due to human nature. They are not due to the anarchical setting of international politics. War is just an institution that can be abandoned by states who decide to no longer practice power politics. And according to him, the Dutch, Holland, the Netherlands were the first to do so. This is why he calls this process, which also regarded, according to him, Switzerland, even Sweden, etc. Or nowadays, some states like Singapore, trading states, he considers the Dutch to be at the origin of this so-called Hollandization process. Anyway, during the periods which we are interested in, no major cycle of war broke out by definition. The two periods are separate. The periods that there was a major cycle of war at the origin, the 30 Years' War, and there will be one at the very end, the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Empire, to which we will come back at the end of today's class. So no general war similar to the 30 Years broke out up to the French Revolution. That said, the period nevertheless was characterized by a somehow seemingly never-ending number of wars. Here is the list of wars that occurred first in Western and Central Europe, but also in North and Eastern Europe. So I already mentioned the fact that the Franco-Spanish War went on up to 1659. England and the Netherlands fought three short wars from 1652 to 1674. The issue at stake was the control of various trade routes. Both were naval powers. They had managed to get rid of the Spaniards, at least in the Atlantic Ocean. The issue at stake was to control trade routes and also some colonial territories. You may know that the Dutch founded New Amsterdam, which after their defeat against the English became New York. The Dutch were also opposed to the French, first during the so-called War of Devolution, 1667, 1668, and then the Franco-Dutch War, 72 to 78. The issue at stake was the control of today's Flanders, that is to say, the very northern part of today's France. The wars were won by the French. The War of the League of Augsburg, sometimes called 9 Years' War, broke out in 1688 and lasted until 1697. It opposed France to a coalition, including the Dutch, the Austrian, the Spaniards, the Holy Roman Empire. More important than this 9 Years' War is, we come back to it, the War of the Spanish Succession, an indirect consequence of France's foreign political ambitions. We will come back to it. It opposed France and Spain on the one hand to a coalition, to an alliance headed by the British or the English and the Dutch, including also Austria and Prussia. Here is a map of the four wars, ladies and gentlemen, that France was involved in during the reign of Louis XIV, that is to say, throughout the second half, almost the second half of the 17th century and the very beginning of the 18th century. Another war occurred in 1740. It was the War of the Austrian Succession, opposing once again France, allied to Prussia, to Austria, the Dutch, and the British. In 1756 broke out the 7 Years' War, which, to some extent, geographically speaking, can be considered to be the first world war. Why? Because the battles opposing the two camps occurred all at once in Europe, but also in North America, we'll come back to it, and in India, to say on the South Asian continent. On the one hand, England was allied to Prussia, which was an original alliance because England was almost systematically opposed to Prussia. And Austria, the traditional rival or enemy or opponent of France, was an ally of France. Here we have a concrete example of the shifting alliance strategy which characterized at that time multipolar systems and the strategy of the foreign policy strategy adopted by the then states. To these wars regarding what we may consider from a Western European perspective as the most important ones, because they took place or they regarded Western and Central European powers, we should add powers taking place in Northern and Eastern Europe. The Great Northern War from 1700 to 1721, opposing Russia to Sweden. The victory of Russia permitted Russia to become a major power, to control the Baltic Sea. Russia was opposed also to the Turks, to the Ottomans, for the control of the Caucasus. You know that Crimea some years ago became once again a Russian territory thanks to Putin's undertaking. The argument put forward by Putin was the following one: Crimea always has been a Russian rather than an Ukrainian territory, which regarding Russia and Ukraine and Ukraine is somehow correct. Indeed, Crimea, which had been a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, was conquered in the late 18th century by the Russians. And the Ottomans also fought wars against Austria. They besieged Vienna 3 times, the last time in 1683, before being definitely repelled, but going on controlling the most significant part of the Balkans. So a seemingly never-ending series of wars opposing more or less regularly the major or the different European powers. How then, ladies and gentlemen, can we try to describe, to analyze, theoretically speaking, these wars, or maybe how were they theoretically analyzed by the then political thinkers, by the then people who were witnessing, experiencing these wars? The first one, ladies and gentlemen, to have a look at these wars or to propose analysis was Thomas Hobbes, also influenced, of course, by the context of the 30 Years' War. His Leviathan was published in 1651, that is to say, 3 years after the end of the 30 Years' War, to some extent, of course. A book that is published in 1651 was conceived during the preceding years, so the very end of the 30 Years' War. Hobbes, in his Leviathan, mostly in the chapter 13, put forward his assumption, which will be the bedrock assumption of realism in international relations theory, including contemporary theory. That is to say, the fact that international politics, because of the anarchical principle, the fact that there is no authority above states, international politics is synonymous with a never-ending state of war, the state of nature or the state of anarchy. The two expressions are synonymous, is synonymous with a never-ending state of war. Listen to Thomas Hobbes, chapter 13 of his Leviathan. In all times, kings and persons of sovereign authority, because of their independence, are in continuous jealousies in the state and posture of gladiators. You know what gladiators are doing. Having their weapons pointing, their eyes fixed on one another, that there's their forts, their garrisons, and guns upon the frontiers of their kingdom. Continual spies upon their neighbors, which is an attitude of war. And in another chapter, a bit further on in his Leviathan, this is what he writes, this is what he wrote: states and commonwealths not dependent on one another, that is to say, independent from one another, that is to say, sovereign. Nation states, would we say nowadays, live in the condition of a perpetual war, upon the confines of battle, with their frontiers armed and cannons planted against their neighbors round about. The state of nature, which characterizes international politics, is synonymous with a state of war. Please make sure to understand the profound meaning of the expression state of war. It does not mean that everyday effective battles, effective wars are occurring, are taking place. This is not the meaning of the state of war. The state of war merely means that states, political units, independent units, always consider war to be a normal, irrational means of permitting a state to obtain satisfaction on the international scene. War is a normal instrument, is considered by states to be a normal instrument, and they therefore will resort to it as soon as they believe that it is in their interest to do so. Listen to Hobbes once again. War consists not in battle only, or in the act of fighting. War consists in a tract of time wherein the will to contend by battle is sufficiently known. As long as every state knows that every other state is likely to go to war, the state of war will prevail in international politics. War consists, I quote again, not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. As long as states are disposed to go to war, the state of war prevails. Which amounts to saying that peace can only prevail when states abandon the idea, the conviction, the internalized conviction that war is a normal instrument of their foreign political behavior. And since at that time this was not the case, and according to realists to some extent, it is not either the case nowadays, but liberals or constructivists would disagree with that. Since at that time, all the states considered that one day or another, sooner or later, they might be tempted to go to war at that time, and in Hobbes' philosophy, this is the case, there could be no peace among states. The period separating effective battles of the past from effective battles of the future, this period was not a peace. It was a mere truce, a mere ceasefire, separating the wars of the past from the wars of the future, which sooner or later would break out. And when then we look at the list of wars that I gave you, it is obviously difficult not to agree with Hobbes' very pessimistic picture of international politics. When we look at the years characterized by wars, when we look at the protagonists involved in these wars, we see that the then major European powers very regularly resorted to armed violence. Their will to contend by battle always existed. The years of ceasefire were less numerous than the years of effective battles. And so, to some extent at least, at first sight, could I say, it is not that surprising that authors, thinkers, as different from Hobbes as Rousseau, first, the French Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the Prussian Immanuel Kant, came to the same conclusion, proposed the same picture of international politics as a never-ending state of war. Listen to Rousseau in his fragments on the state of war, which is a short essay, but important for international relations scholars as the contrat social, social contract, as for philosophers in general. According to Rousseau in 1760, so 100 years after Thomas Hobbes, the state of war is the natural relation of one power to another. The natural relation of two states is a relation of a state of war. Why? Because there is a settled intention manifested on both sides to destroy the enemy state. The powers of Europe, listen to Rousseau, stand to each other strictly in a state of war, and all the separate treaties between them are in the nature rather of a temporary truce than a real peace. It is exactly the same conception of international politics as Hobbes' conception. There can be no peace, there are only periods of truce, because there is a manifest intention to destroy an enemy state, a reciprocally shared intention. And Kant, a bit later in 1795, in his Perpetual Peace sketch, started his essay with exactly the same idea. The natural state of relations among units is, I quote, one of war, is one of war. The rulers of states are insatiable of war, And more generally, there exists an unceasing threat of war, even if there are no open hostilities, even when there are no effective battles. There is an unceasing threat of war. Never do states abandon the idea that they might go toward a disposition to contend by battle always exists in the mind of statesmen. And therefore, international politics is synonymous with a never-ending state of war. Hobbes, Rousseau, Kant. Very pessimistic analysis. But other philosophers, other political thinkers disagreed with them. They put forward alternative analysis. And the first one is the French philosopher of the Enlightenment century, Voltaire. In his Age of Louis XIV, Le siècle de Louis XIV, written in 1750s at the same time as Rousseau's Fragments on War, on the state of war. And Voltaire proposed a fairly different analysis of the then international political situation in Europe. Listen to this. For some time now, this is what he wrote, for some time now it is possible to consider Christian Europe, give or take Russia, as a sort of great commonwealth, une espèce de grande république, a sort of great commonwealth. For some time now, it is possible to consider Europe as a sort of great commonwealth. Give or take Russia. Give or take Russia. That is to say, he was not sure that Russia was part of this European republic, of this European commonwealth. And, if I may, the same perception. Nowadays, 250 years later, a bit more than 2 centuries and a half later, the perception of Russia from our Western perspective here is almost exactly the same. We do not know whether Russia is genuinely European or not. Let's come back to Rousseau. So why then should Europe be considered as a sort of great commonwealth? Because though it is partitioned, divided into several states, some monarchic, others mixed, some aristocratic, others popular, they all deal with one another. They have the same basic religion, though this religion is divided in different sects, an allusion to the Protestants and the Catholics. What's more, they all have the same principles of public law, which was the then term that designated what nowadays we call international law, the public law of Europe. We come back to it in our second part. They all share the same principles of public law, unknown in other parts of the world. And because of these principles, I go on quoting, European nations do not enslave their prisoners, they respect the ambassadors of the enemies, etc., etc. Above all, and this is the point I would like you to remember, and this here is the analysis radically different from Hobbes, Rousseau, and Kant. To come back to Kant in order to avoid any mistake, ladies and gentlemen, any confusion, Kant started with claiming that the natural state is a state of war. The state of nature among nation states is a state of war. But given that he believes in the possibility, given that he wrote an essay on the perpetual peace, he thinks it is possible to overcome this state of war and to establish a perpetual peace. I come back to Voltaire. The most important point in Voltaire, which radically differs from Hobbes' analysis, is the following one. Above all, the European states form a sort of great commonwealth because they agree on the wise policy of maintaining an equal balance of power. They agree on the wise policy of maintaining an equal balance of power between themselves as far as they can. Between themselves as far as they can. So, the European countries, despite being divided, despite being independent, form a republic for different reasons, and for the most important one, regarding the material dimension we are interested in here, they agree in adopting a balance of power strategy, maintaining a balance, that is to say, an equal distribution of power resources among the major powers. And the same analysis will be put forward by the Swiss jurist Emer de Vatel, who had been the counselor of the King of Saxony, a German entity which was a rival of Prussia within the Holy Roman Emperor. Listen to de Vatel in his Le Droit des Gens, The Law of Nations, which was also published in the midst of the 18th century. Europe, it's fairly the same analysis as Voltaire. Europe forms a political system, a body, closely connected by relations, by the relations and the different interests of the nations inhabiting this part of the world. So in Europe, political units form a political body. It is no longer, as had been the case in the past, a confused heap of detached pieces. Europe is a kind of republic, commonwealth, it's the same idea as Voltaire, of which the members, all independent but linked to one another, unite in order to maintain liberty and order. So they agree upon the same objective to maintain order, stability, and liberty, independence of the different members. Thanks to what? Thanks, listen to this, the important point, similar to the one of Voltaire, thanks to the famous scheme of the political balance or the equilibrium of power. Thanks to the famous scheme of the balance of power or the equilibrium, the political balance or the equilibrium of power. A system of policy which in itself is highly just and wise as long as it is pursued, by means of alliances, confederacies, and other methods equally lawful. As long as the states resort to lawful means, Europe is a balanced system, that is to say, characterized by an equal distribution of power resources among the major states, which permits stability to prevail. So we have two sets, ladies and gentlemen, of analysis. On the one hand, Hobbes plus Rousseau plus Kant, instability is prevailing because of the never-ending state of war. Always wars are likely to break out. And on the other hand, Voltaire and de Vatel, stability is possible. At least it is what states try to maintain thanks to their balance of power strategy. They not merely go to war against each other, they also aim at maintaining stability. The question then we may ask, or I feel free to ask, is the following one: who's right and who's wrong? Is Hobbes right or is Voltaire right? I think, ladies and gentlemen, that the answer to this question must be looked for in the context. The context of Hobbes on the one hand and Voltaire and Vatel on the other is different. 100 years or so separate Vatel and Voltaire on the one hand, Hobbes on the other. Hobbes wrote in the midst of the 17th century, Vatel and Voltaire in the midst of the 18th century. And Voltaire and Vatel had witnessed the proclaimed willingness of the major European powers to try to maintain a kind of stability, which had not been the case of Hobbes. In other words, there was a kind of evolution, or at least there was a kind of discourse claiming that it was possible to go out of the civil war, which was prevailing during Hobbes' lifetime. So let's have a look at this evolution. Let's have a look at the empirical, historical reality before coming back again to a more theoretical approach. How did the major powers behave during our period? We already saw at the very beginning that France was the major victor of the 30 Years' War. And after its triumph in the 30 Years' War, France adopted a foreign policy behavior which was very, very similar to the one of the Spaniards and more generally of the Habsburgs. That is to say, it aimed at controlling Europe, at becoming the most powerful unit on the continent. It was first ruled by Cardinal Mazarin when Louis XIV was a child, and then by Louis XIV himself. And despite the objective that they had pursued when intervening against Austria and Spain in the 30 Years' War, that is to say, they had proclaimed their willingness to prevent Austria from becoming a monarchy likely to control the rest of Europe, France exactly pursued the same objective. It wanted to profit from its victory in order to take the place of Austria or the Habsburgs as Europe's leading power. Listen to Henry Kissinger in his World Order. With a unified kingdom possessing a skilled bureaucracy and a military surpassing that of any neighboring state, France, the France of Louis XIV, was for a while, it is important to come back to it, in a position to seek dominance in Europe. Louis XIV's reign resolved itself into a series of almost continuous wars. We saw this in our list. 4 major wars were fought by the French, 2 against only under the reign of Louis XIV, the 2 against the Dutch, then the one of the League of Augsburg, and last but not least, the one of the Spanish succession. I think we can even go as far as making a difference between France's behavior and the Spanish or the Habsburgs' behavior, the Spaniards or the Habsburgs' behavior. Why? Because the Spanish predominance and the wars fought by Spain or the Habsburgs to maintain their predominance were all in all defensive wars. Even the 30 Years' War, Austria just wanted to maintain or to re-establish a kind of status quo. It did not want to overthrow by expanding, overthrow the existing order. The same was not true for France. France of Louis XIV was guided by a dynamic, offensive kind of expansionism, as proven exactly by the 4 major wars fought by Louis XIV. The first wars and the first initiative of the French was successful. Against Spain in 1659, the Treaty of the Pyrenees. Against the Dutch, the 2 wars against the Dutch also were successful. 2 treaties were signed with the Low Countries, permitting France to enlarge its territories. Here we have a map of Louis XIV's conquests up to the end of the 17th century. Henry Kissinger sums up this evolution in the following way. At first, the generals of Louis XIV, of Louis XIV, won battles everywhere. So France was successful. You may know also that France was the first state, nation state, to establish what we now could call a standing army. No more mercenaries, as had been the case previously. A standing, permanent army, controlled by French generals who themselves were politically, who accepted the political authority of the king, of the Sun King of Louis XIV. So at first, Louis XIV's generals won battles everywhere, but ultimately, I go on quoting Kissinger, they were defeated or contained everywhere. And the turning point is the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1703 to 1714. Louis XIV died in 1714 or 1715, I don't remember anymore. Anyway, so the War of the Spanish Succession, ladies and gentlemen, broke out because of the following events. In Spain, the last king, member of the Habsburg family, remember Charles V, Felipe II, etc., were members of the Habsburg family. The last king of the Habsburg family died at the very end of the 17th century. The question then of who was likely to be the successor, this question was asked. And Louis XIV, in his expansionist policy, came to the idea that his own grandson should be put on the throne of Madrid. He was successful in doing so, but in doing so, there was a risk, at least this is how the other European units perceived the then political situation, there was a risk of too close a connection between Spain and France, since Louis XIV's own grandson was now king of Spain, no more a member of the Habsburg family, but a member of the French royal family. Given this risk of a kind of Spanish-French axis likely to upset the then existing equilibrium in Europe, the English and the Dutch formed a coalition. The Holy Roman Empire also joined the alliance. In order to do what? In order to defeat the French. And they were successful. France was defeated. It was the first significant defeat in the rivalry opposing France to England, which became Great Britain in 1707, as far as I remember, when Scotland was integrated in the British Union. The first defeat of the French, the first significant victory of the English against the French. Once the French defeated, a peace treaty was signed. It is the so-called Utrecht settlements. Utrecht is a town in the then Netherlands, still nowadays, today's Netherlands. And it is in the Treaty of Utrecht that the balance of power principle emphasized by Voltaire, by de Vatel, was explicitly adopted. Listen to the Utrecht Treaty, the war, those who signed the treaty, that is to say, both the victors and France and Spain, the losers. In the preamble, it is emphasized that the war was at the beginning undertaken because of the great danger which threatened the liberty and safety of all Europe. Because of the great danger which threatened the liberty and safety of all Europe, due to the too close conjunction of the kingdoms of Spain and France. The Franco-Spanish axis, the perspective of this axis, was conceived by the British and the Dutch as a danger, because it was likely to upset the then prevailing balance. And then the treaty goes on after this preamble in determining the objective pursued. The aim of the parties, those who signed the treaty, is, listen to this, to establish the peace and tranquility of Christendom. There was still an allusion to the Christian civilization of Europe. The parties are eager to establish the peace and tranquility of Christendom by an equal balance of power. By an equal balance of power, which is the best and most solid foundation of a mutual friendship and of a concord which will be lasting on all sides. I sum up this idea according to the parties, the states signing the Treaty of Utrecht 1714. The balance of power is the best means to maintain stability, to prevent wars from regularly breaking out. And it is this will, this intention explicitly manifested in the Treaty of Utrecht, which Voltaire and de Vatel will have in mind when claiming, when emphasizing that despite the fact that Europe is composed by different units, these units form a republic, a commonwealth, because they agree upon the balance of power in maintaining, they agree upon the objective pursued to maintain an equilibrium of power, a balanced distribution. No power should become more powerful than any of the other major power. And therefore, to some extent, when compared to Hobbes, Voltaire and de Vatel are somehow right. And I would say that their analysis has two advantages when compared to Hobbes' very pessimistic outlook. First of all, they do not merely see the wars that regularly break out, they also see at least the proclaimed intention of trying to prevent wars from breaking out. So they take into account the power configuration, but they also take into account the regulation efforts undertaken in order to try to avoid the never-ending state of war to prevail throughout the decades. They emphasize the manifested intention to maintain a balance of power. This is the first advantage. The second advantage is that they are aware of the ambiguity of these efforts. Or maybe should I say, they are aware of the limits of the proclaimed intention by the major European powers. Listen to Voltaire once again. He claims that Christian Europe forms a great commonwealth, etc., because beyond the principles of international law, etc., that they share, they agree in maintaining the balance of power as far as they can. I emphasize, as far as they can, which amounts to saying that Voltaire himself is not convinced that they will always be able, as far as they can, they will not always be able to do so, which amounts to saying that he is a bit skeptical about the possibility for this balance of power strategy to systematically prevail. And the same is true for Vatel. For de Vatel, what does he say? Well, the balance of power policy is a wise policy as long as it is pursued by lawful means. Which means if we read, if he interprets his hidden opinion of de Vatel, sometimes the balance of power policy is not practiced by lawful means. Unlawful means are used, which amounts to saying that the balance of power policy is not always pursued. So de Vatel and Voltaire, actually, and this is the point I would like you to remember, acknowledged what we may call the intrinsic ambiguity of the regulation efforts undertaken by the then European powers throughout the period from 1648 to the French Revolution and to Napoleon's defeat in 1815. Yes, there ain't no doubt that such regulation efforts were made. And this explains probably why no major cycle of wars broke out similar to the 30 Years' War, or similar to the one that we will see at the end of today's class, that is to say, the cycle of the wars of the French Revolution and of the Napoleonic Empire. So efforts were made, but there is little doubt that these efforts were fragile, contradictory, because to some extent wars were part of the balance of power strategy. As soon as one state was perceived to be too powerful, was perceived to be likely to become too powerful, a war was undertaken to prevent this state from becoming too powerful. In other words, the balance of power, the proclaimed balance of power is the core point of my analysis. The then proclaimed balance of power was actually power politics disguised in balance of power. It was power politics disguised as balance of power politics. And the reason, I think, is the following one. Ladies and gentlemen, why should the balance of power system favor stability? How can we explain this very optimistic claim according to which, when there is a balance, stability prevails? Let's come back to the definition of the balance. According to de Vattel, the balance of power, or the equilibrium of power, I quote, is a disposition of things so that no one power is able absolutely to predominate. A balance of power exists as long as no power is more powerful, no unit is more powerful than each of the other ones taken individually. And the same conception, the same definition is put forward by David Hume in one of his essays, which is called On the Balance of Power. Hume, the Scottish philosopher of the Enlightenment century. According to David Hume, I give you his definition of the balance of power, it's the same. The balance of power is a configuration of powers, of political units, within which no state benefits from such a force so as to prevent the neighboring states from defending their rights against it. A balance of power exists as long as all the states are able to defend themselves against any other, because no one of the other one is more significantly more powerful than themselves. So at the origin of the idea that this balance should be favorable to stability, to peace to some extent, or at least to stability, at the origin of this idea is what Henry Kissinger, ladies and gentlemen, in his PhD dissertation, A World Restored, calls the classical history, the classical lesson of history. The classic expression of the lesson of history, according to which no order is safe when there is a superior power. According, ladies and gentlemen, to this interpretation, if one unit is more powerful than all the other one, that is to say, when there is an imbalance of power, this powerful state sooner or later will aggress the other ones. It is doomed to behave aggressively, to expand. And then, by definition, the security, the safety, the independence of all the other ones will be threatened. Therefore, only a balanced distribution of power resources, roughly all the states control the same amount of resources, economic and military. Only in this configuration is stability likely to prevail. Why? For the very simple reason that when you know that you are not more powerful than your opponent, you cannot come to the conclusion that it will be easy for you to win the war. When you know that your opponent roughly is as strong as yourself, you cannot bet on a victory. So you should adopt a prudent foreign policy, which consists in negotiating, in privileging peaceful means of conflict resolution, because you cannot expect the kind of positive utility from going to war, given that your adversary has as many possibilities, chances, statistical probability to win the war as yourself. It would be irrational, foolish for a state to go to war if it is not sure that it will be easily won. And this balance of power conception is compatible with the ancient wisdom summed up in the Roman phrase civis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. If you want peace, be as strong as your opponent. Because in this case, your opponent, knowing that you will be as strong as itself, your opponent will not dare to attack you. He will be deterred from attacking you. So the balance of power principle is another expression of the traditional, the classical deterrence policy. If all the states are roughly equal regarding the amount of resources that they control, material resources they control, they all deter each other from attacking, because no one can expect to easily win a war in the case it launches such a war. This is the traditional conception shared by the majority of realists and also of past philosophers. Only a balanced distribution of power resources is likely to permit stability to prevail, and therefore a system must be either multipolar, at least three major powers, or it must be bipolar. A unipolar system, by definition, is characterized by one superior power. And according to these theorists, such a unipolar system is dangerous because the prevailing power is tempted to profit from its preeminent resources to endanger the security of all the other ones. And to some extent, ladies and gentlemen, for balance of power theorists, a unipolar structure is not conceivable, is not possible, precisely because all the other states will prevent the prospectively too powerful state from becoming too powerful. By maintaining the balance, by adopting the balance of power strategy, they aim at preventing anyone from becoming too powerful. If none of the existing powers becomes too powerful, there can be no unipolar structure. According to this approach, we will see that other realists, a minority of realists, and I do share the analysis, we claim the opposite. We'll come back to this in another chapter. So the balance of power theory claims that stability is favored by a balanced distribution of power. There is, however, ladies and gentlemen, here my criticism starts. There is, however, a problem with this claim. Obviously, when you know that you are not stronger than your opponent, you should not resort to violence against your opponent because you are not sure to win. But if your opponent has a similar amount of resources than yourself, you are sure that your opponent is not stronger than you by definition. Your opponent is not weaker, but he's not stronger. So you can bet on your victory rather than on your defeat. You can come to the conclusion, I have as many chances to win as I have chances to lose. My opponent is not stronger than myself. So I can bet on the victory. Which amounts to saying that a balance of power is favorable to stability only if the statesmen or the statesmen are risk averse rather than risk tolerant leaders. If they think that despite the equal distribution, they have as many chances to win as to lose, if they are risk tolerant, if they are gamblers, they will not stop short from going to war. Since they have as many chances to win as to lose, by definition, there is a balanced distribution of power resources. And this is the conclusion drawn by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his fragments on the state of war, a prince, a statesman. Considering to go to war, knows, I quote, well enough that he is running risks. Of course, he can lose the war, but he is less struck with the risks than which the gains that he expects. He is much less afraid of fortune, of bad fortune, than he is confident in his own wisdom. The majority of politicians and statesmen, by definition, are successful politicians because they got rid of their rival politicians within their state, within their country. The majority of politicians, and all the more so the majority of politicians, are optimistic. They believe in their wisdom, in their capacity to win what they are undertaking. I go on quoting Rousseau, if the prince is strong, he counts upon his armies. If he is weak, he counts on his allies. So he will always find an argument to go to war as long as his opponent is not stronger than himself, which is the case by definition in the balanced distribution of power. And if we remember, and if you go back, to Thomas Hobbes' conception of the state of war, I do think that those realists that consider a balance of power distribution to be favorable to stability actually betray Hobbes' realist philosophy. We saw some minutes ago that, according to Hobbes in his Leviathan, the state of nature is a never-ending state of war. All the states regularly go to war against each other, just as all the men, the primitive men, before the social contract was signed, before a political units were established, all the states, just as all the men, go to war against each other. Why was this the case? Why was this the case in Leviathan, in Hobbes' Leviathan? Well, according to Hobbes, men were wolves to other men because, I quote, of the equality of ability. The equality of ability. Because, I quote, nature has made men equal in the faculties of body and mind. Nature has made men equal in the capacities of mind and body, physical strength. From this equality originates a physical and intellectual strength, faculty. From this equality originates an equality of hope in the attaining of our objectives. All the men in the state of nature believe that they can achieve their objective, and therefore life in Hobbes' state of nature is short, brutish, violent, because all the men are likely to go to war against all the other men, since they are equal in mind and physical strength. If then this is the case for men in the primitive state of nature, it will be the case for nation states in the state of anarchy, since there is no authority, just as there was no authority above men in the primitive state of nature. To come back to our system, international political system of the period from 1648 to 1815, the then existing states and the then leaders, the then statesmen, believed that they had a chance to win in the case they went to war. Risk tolerance was prevailing over risk aversion, and therefore the stability did not prevail. Stability in is likely to prevail in a balanced power, in a balanced power system, in a balanced configuration, as long as leaders accept the status quo. But if they want to change the status quo, they will not be frightened by the fact that their adversaries are as strong as themselves. Throughout the period that we are analyzing, ladies and gentlemen, all the leaders were driven by the eagerness to increase their power, to control more territories than they were already possessing. International politics was perceived to be a zero-sum game. The idea was summed up by the Russian Tsarina Catherine at the end of the 18th century. Listen to Katarina, who gains nothing loses. Who gains nothing loses. So they all try to gain, given the perspective of losing, and they try to do so by launching wars, hoping that they might prevail, since the adversary was not that more powerful, was not more powerful. Actually, this at least was their perception. Therefore, the balance of power system that was prevailing throughout our period was actually a balance of conquests. The expression is due to Paul Schröder, historian, diplomatic historian, who wrote a very, very important and very interesting book, The Transformation of European Politics. To put it differently, the then prevailing political behavior, foreign political behavior, was constitutive of power politics, but more specifically of offensive power politics rather than of defensive power politics. There are two kinds of power politics. Defensive power politics, when you accumulate physical strength, military force to maintain your security. This is defensive power politics. And then you have offensive power politics, when you increase, when you accumulate physical strength to increase your power, that is to say, your capacity to impose your will upon somebody else. To prevent someone from imposing his or her will upon you is defensive. To try to impose your will upon somebody else is offensive. Power politics is a general term which distinguishes offensive from defensive power politics. Politique de puissance in French. The Germans have two terms which permit to distinguish the offensive from the defensive types of power politics. Machtpolitik is offensive power politics. Realpolitik is defensive power politics. During our period, all the then prevailing powers, their statesmen, were driven by Machtpolitik considerations, by the eagerness to increase their power detrimentally to their prospective rivals, which amounts to saying that the final result of our period here, during our period here, was exactly the opposite of the proclaimed aim, stability and peace. And this is the reason why there was a never-ending succession of wars, because all the states regularly tried to impose their will upon the other ones. The periods going from 1648 to 1815 was a period of violent conflicts, of never-ending violent conflicts, opposing all the major powers. They merely agreed upon one thing: to spoil the smaller ones. That is to say, Poland was regularly divided among the Prussians, the Austrians, the Russians. Various German and Italian entities lost regularly their independence. They were acquired by the other major European powers, and the Ottoman Empire was uh, curtailed in the Balkans and in the Caucasus. So the history of our periods here, the history of international politics, of European international politics, from the end of the 30 Years' War to the French Revolution, proved that the balance of power system is an international system, not merely in the meaning of Hadley Bull, states having regular interactions upon each other, but in the meaning of Renoir in his Peace and War. How does Renoir define a system? A system, listen to Renoir, is a set of political units that maintain regular interactions among one another. This is compatible with Hadley Bull's definition, that maintain regular interactions with one another and that are likely of being implicated in a generalized war. A system, according to Renoir, Peace and War, the international political system is a set of units likely to get involved in regular wars. It perfectly describes the international political system of our period 1648 to 1815. The balance of power system, ladies and gentlemen, be the multipolar system, be the bipolar system, is likely to end up favoring wars rather than permitting stability to prevail. In our case here, it was a balance of competition, according to Schroeder, rather than a balance of satisfaction. The major powers did not satisfy with the existing order. They tried to overthrow the status quo in order to become themselves more powerful. And I cannot help from thinking that if we apply this knowledge to today's world, there is a region where a kind of equilibrium, perceived balance exists. It is the Middle East. And in the Middle East, it is a regional system. In the Middle East, where roughly there is a kind of equilibrium between Iran, Turkey, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. No more Iraq because it was definitely weakened after America's intervention in 2003. The Middle East is anything but a stable system. And within the five regional powers that I mentioned, the major rivalry opposes Saudi Arabia to Iran. So even if we consider the bipolarity between these two regional powers, it is not stable. They are fighting a proxy war, notably in Yemen. So I do not think, ladies and gentlemen, that balanced systems are likely to permit stability to prevail. I rather think the opposite. Balanced systems favor wars because any of the existing powers may hope rationally, may expect rationally a positive utility from going to war. This analysis, ladies and gentlemen, I think is corroborated by the last of our wars, the 7 Years' War that broke out in 1756. It lasted 7 years up to 1763. It's the most important, I would say, Franco-English or Franco-British war. The two were once again at the head of two different alliances. Though Prussia, a traditional French ally, became the ally of Great Britain, while Austria, the traditional enemy of France, became the ally of France. This war was launched by the British. It was initiated by the British, not by the French. Why? Because the British, I quote Lascurette, were impressed by France's recovery after the defeats of Louis XIV. And Great Britain was also impressed by the colonial conquests of the French, notably North America. So there's Canada, but also what then was called La Louisiane Française. Louisiane comes from Louis. It is a tribute to the French Louis XIV, 15, 16, etc. So this war launched by the British proves that the basic rivalry during our period here was the Franco-British rivalry, despite the multipolar system of 5 or 6 major European powers. Systematically, France was either the initiator of a war or the target of a war initiated by its enemies and first and foremost by the British. So the struggle for mastery between the French and the British was the dominant characteristic of this 18th century, dominant idea running through the century in the mind of the then statesman. This war, ladies and gentlemen, ended with Great Britain's very significant victory, first and foremost in North America. France lost the war, significant battles took place in today's Quebec, the city of Quebec, and Great Britain very significantly increased its North American colonies. Given France's defeat, and France to some extent was even humiliated, it was exhausted, it was defeated, given that Great Britain almost became invulnerable, a kind of stability should have been possible because there was gradually a gap favorable to Great Britain, detrimental to France. What's more, the other powers, the other continental powers, were unlikely to threaten Great Britain's preeminence. Russia was safe. It exerted its domination all at once in Northern Europe, the Baltic Sea, and in the Caucasus against the Ottomans. And regarding Austria and Prussia, they were more and more caught in their rivalry within the Holy Roman Empire. So they focused on this issue and could hardly have ambitions likely to threaten Great Britain. So, to some extent, stability could have prevailed. Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, this was not the case. Why? Because the French Revolution broke out. The French Revolution broke out in 1789, and it is at the origin of a new cycle of major wars, lasting from 1792 to 1815, of 24 years. The cycle of the wars of the French Revolution and of the Napoleonic Empire is a cycle of major wars because of the length, 24 years, roughly similar to 30, and also because it will be at the origin of a new order which will start in 1815. It is similar, according to Henry Kissinger, to the 30 Years' War. Why? Because there is a mixture of foreign political consideration and domestic consideration, just as, or domestic factors having an impact upon international politics, just as the religious quarrel in the Holy Roman Empire ended up provoking the intervention of foreign powers, thus transforming the civil war in the then Germanic territories into the 30 Years' War, which was an international war, the French Revolution, which was a domestic upheaval against the French absolutist monarchy, ended up in a series of war opposing first the French to all the other continental European powers, and then also to the British. Listen to Kissinger. The French Revolution proclaimed a domestic and a world order different from the then prevailing system. The passions exceeded those of the 30 Years' War. A secular crusade, the French were eager to spread the national popular sovereignty principle in order to replace the monarchic principle. The secular crusade replaced the religious crusades, Protestants against Catholics, of the 30 Years' War. The first war, this cycle can be divided into two parts. The first part regards the wars of the French Revolution, which last up to the end of the 18th century. It permitted France to expand. In 1799, here you see what revolutionary France had been able to achieve. It controlled territories such as today's Belgium and Luxembourg. It conquered Savoy, which remained French. It established satellite regimes on its eastern borders. The wars fought by the French revolutionaries had started in 1792. The Girondins, who then were in the then French government, the Jacobins arrived a bit later, were driven by also what we should call a diversionary motivation. That is to say, you know, that the French Revolution triggered the outbreak of a kind of a civil war in France. The French Revolution was rejected, notably in the western part of France, in Bretagne, in La Vendée. And so the Girondins found, of course, when fighting against the Austrians, who tried to overthrow the revolution, they found a diversionary motive. That is to say, by targeting the foreign enemy, they were able to recreate the national unity that had been lost because of those French who rejected the revolution because they wanted monarchy, the absolutist monarchy, to go on prevailing. So the wars of the French Revolution, of the first period of this cycle, were both due to domestic reasons, at least at the beginning, and to more traditional objectives pursued by the French, notably to reach what France considers as its natural borders, that is to say, the Rhine River, the Alps in its relations with Switzerland and Italy, and also its traditional motivation to weaken Austria, the Habsburgs, and to establish friendly regimes on its eastern borders, which France was able to do, as you may see on the map. The Napoleonic episode, that is to say, the wars are starting once Napoleon became an emperor. The Napoleonic wars both confirm and changed the then prevailing practices of the French revolutionaries. Why? Because after the initial victories of Napoleon, which permitted him to control a huge part of the European continent from today's Portugal to today's Poland, Napoleon's victories, initial victories up to 1812, might once again have permitted stability to prevail. Why? Because Napoleon was controlling Western Europe. Russia was not threatened in its Eastern European territory, and England, or Great Britain, of course, went on controlling its overseas empire. So a kind of implicit agreement could have been possible. A kind of coexistence between the three major powers. All the more so, they were separated by the kind of buffer zone, the channel regarding France and Great Britain, Central Europe, Austria and Prussia regarding France and Russia. But the problem is that Napoleon did not satisfy with this kind of status quo, which obviously would have been favorable to France compared to what France had been after its defeat in the 7 Years' War, which we mentioned some minutes ago. He was not satisfied with this status quo. This is the reason why he attacked Russia, which basically was at the origin of his defeat. And if he attacked Russia, it is to control the whole European continent in order to definitely get rid of the British, in order to definitely become more powerful than the British because, in the case of controlling the European continent, Napoleon could have threatened Great Britain's overseas preeminence. Napoleon hated the British and he despised them. He called Great Britain, ladies and gentlemen, he called Great Britain a nation of shopkeepers. And this is the reason why he wanted to defeat Great Britain. According to Henry Kissinger, Napoleon was a different kind of statesman. He was what Kissinger calls a great man. A new type of statesman, the great man, who is eager to control the world by his own will, who is driven by his kind of charismatic magnetism, who is driven by his personal success in his military undertakings, which amounts to saying that Napoleon refused any limit. He wanted to reorder the world according to his authority, just as Hitler will try to do during his reign and during the World War II that he has at the origin of. Remember that Napoleon crowned himself emperor in Rome. Charlemagne had been crowned by the Pope, which amounts to saying that he had recognized the spiritual authority of the Pope. This is not the case for Napoleon. He himself put the crown on his head. His ambition, to put it differently, knew no limits. And he did acknowledge this himself. Listen to Napoleon. Listen to Napoleon. The French are very proud of Napoleon. My power depends on my glory. My glory depends on my victories. I have won the victories at the origin of my glory. My power will fail if I do not feed it on new glories and new victories. Conquest, I go on quoting, conquest has made me what I am, and only conquest will enable me to hold my position. So he was driven to undertake one conquest after another. In other words, to put it differently, his foreign policy was constitutive of an imperialist policy. What is imperialism? The term, ladies and gentlemen, was coined during Napoleon's lifetime. Imperialists were those favorable to Napoleon's empire. Nowadays, imperialism is a pejorative word. When you designate a state a power to be imperialist, the US, for instance, imperialistic, it is tantamount to stigmatizing this power. At the time, it was neutral. An imperialist was someone favorable to Napoleon's empire. And Napoleon adopted an imperialist policy, that is to say, a policy consisting in conquering militarily other territories in order to dominate them politically, in order to exert the political authority upon the militarily conquered territory. That's why he invaded Russia. This decision was at the origin of his defeat. And the fact that he was eager to create an empire also proves that he wanted to transform the then existing international system. And maybe should I say he wanted to put an end to the international system. Remember, an international system is a set of states, of independent states having regular interactions. If you create an empire, there are no more states because they are integrated by definition in the empire. This is what had been prevailing in the past up to the end of the 15th century and explicitly up to 1648, when the anarchical principle, that is to say the sovereignty principle, that is to say the reality of independent states, independent from one another, started definitely prevailing. He wanted Napoleon to transform this international system into an empire, that is to say, to transform nation states into French colonies in Europe. In doing so, ladies and gentlemen, and I come back to a more theoretical consideration, he changed the then prevailing international system, which was a homogeneous one. This is Raymond Aron's expression. He changed it, he transformed it into a heterogeneous system. What is a homogeneous system according to Raymond Aron? A homogeneous system is a system composed by units belonging to the same type, obeying the same conception of policy. A heterogeneous system is a system composed by states organized differently, organized according to different principles, and appealing to contradictory values. Napoleon appealed to values different from the ones that had been prevailing up to the French Revolution. No more nation states, but empire. No more monarchical sovereignty, but popular, national sovereignty. He introduced this heterogeneous element. If we apply it to nowadays, we may ask whether the Chinese-American relation is a homogeneous or heterogeneous one. Do they appeal to the same values? Are they organized on the basis of the same principles? Make up your mind. Find your own answer to this question. What is beyond doubt is that Napoleon's vision was heterogeneous. It could not be compatible with the then prevailing conception. The 17th and 18th century were, from 1648 to the French Revolution, was a homogeneous system. Though the statesmen went to war against each other, they agreed upon various principles, what Voltaire and Vattel had emphasized. Napoleon's France appealed to contradictory values in its will to subordinate the sovereignty principle to the imperial principle. And it was precisely, ladies and gentlemen, this heterogeneity which is at the origin of the Vienna Congress, of the peace negotiations which put an end to Napoleon's wars. The consciousness of the immense cost of the spell of violence unchained by Napoleon's behavior, the consciousness of this cost led the European powers to invent new methods of regulations. These new methods of regulations were adopted at the Vienna Congress in 1815 under the initiative of whom? Of Great Britain, the major winner of the Napoleonic Wars, Waterloo, 1815, which amounts to saying that in 1815 a new system emerged, characterized by British preeminence, the so-called Pax Britannica, that we will have a look at next week. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for attending today's class. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you will be back next week. I wish you a great day. See you soon. Goodbye.